The Mona Lisa Unveiled by Science, a lecture given at the LeoLev Centre in Vinci, Italy, on the 3rd June 2022. Before starting, it is important to remember that this is a press conference whose objective is to reveal new elements that could be useful for the understanding of the work. In a limited time, I will therefore go to the essential. All the details of this incredible story of the Arno River deviation cannot be told. Please excuse me in advance. Concision is a difficult art. My lecture will be in 4 points. I will start with the technique because it is an important subject that explains why these discoveries have not been made before. LA.M is an acronym for Layer Amplification Method. In 2004, I was invited by the Louvre Museum and the French Museum's laboratory to digitize the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa plank was presented to me on this cart. Then, it was installed under my direction, in front of the camera on the easel that I had prepared a few days before. The multispectral camera uses a new concept to make scientific measurements of light reflection. The light sweeps over the painting like a scanner. It scans 13 times at different wavelengths. This makes it possible to measure the reaction of the light for each pixel. Today, all museum laboratories use traditional scientific imaging techniques to study paintings. Techniques based on infrared, fluorescence, ultraviolet, or X-ray. They are very useful, but sometimes insufficient to understand the works, especially for the Mona Lisa. I designed the LA.M technique based on this optical and physical principle illustrated on this slide. The penetration and scattering of the light in the paint layer are proportional to the wavelengths. Here is a cross-sectional view of a layer of paint about 1 mm thick. Blue light penetrates less than green light, which penetrates less than red light. The same laws are responsible for the diffusion of the light inside the paint layer, but in all directions. The LA.M technique uses these laws of proportionality. Mathematical treatment of image combinations allow to amplify the images hidden under the apparent layer of the painting. In order to obtain 1,650 images that need to be analyzed. This is the method that I am transmitting today to the students at the University of Bologna. Here is a good example of the use of this method, which allows us to penetrate progressively into the layer of paint to see what seems to be another face, more feminine. It could be very well the real face of Lisa Gherardini. A detailed analysis of all the 1,650 LA.M images and all the discoveries can be found in these 2 books. Regarding the study of the pictorial layers of the Mona Lisa, I start with what seems to me to be the oldest in the chronology. In the sky of Mona Lisa, and without any link with the portrait, we discover this drawing. Obvious, incontestable. The line is sure, well drawn. It could be the preparatory drawing of a spiloncino, a hair needle. This spiloncino was not part of the dress code in Florence, which, in 1503, required that the hair be enclosed in a net. This can be seen in the period portrait in Florence. It is therefore obviously another project. The L.A.M images also reveal a large number of new elements, including beads, avuchi da pomello, a Tuscan term, needles, and shadow play. Drapery outlines, elements which, according to costume historians, cannot belong to a portrait of a real person in Florence in 1503, but to a mystical, allegorical, or religious portrait. Here are some examples. Here is a historical element in favor of this hypothesis of a Madonna project. In 1501, 2 years before painting Lisa Gherardini, Isabella d'Este asked Leonardo in this letter for a Madonna portrait. This is not impossible that Leonardo start his project on this plank, leaving it unfinished, to paint it differently and in a smaller format, as some historians think. The Lisa Gherardini hypothesis. We know with certainty, thanks to these handwriting notes by Agostino Vespucci, in the margin of a book by Cicero, that Leonardo began the portrait of Lisa Gherardini in October 1503. The rules of dress also required dresses with finestrelle, sleeves tied with nastri, a veil over the shoulders, all of which are totally absent from the Mona Lisa portrait today. If Leonardo painted Lisa's Gherardini portrait, then he would have painted these attributes. So they have to be found. Fortunately, Leonardo used a technique of drawing transfer to help us find them. On the poplar plank, Leonardo applies a white preparation. To transfer his drawing, he perforated with small holes on the contours. He takes a black powder, place the drawing on the plank and stamp it with the black, which is transferred to the plank through the holes. This is the Spolvero method. The L.A.M technique will allow us to find these black dots. There is Spolvero on the forehead, where Leonardo draws the embroidery of a hairdressing veil not visible on the painting today. Problem! These veils do not coincide with the position of the Mona Lisa head, but with the position of a face turned on the right. I published this discovery of the Sporvero with Lionel Simoneau, researcher at the CNRS. It was recognized by Elsevier in 2020 and made the front page of the scientific journal. Similarly, Sporvero is also found on the outline of the head. Problem: the line of the Sporvero, positioned higher, do not coincide with the outline of the Mona Lisa's head today. There are several indications that the face we see today is probably not that of Lisa Gherardini. For example, the LA.M images show the hairline more to the right than the one we see today. And this other example, with the crosses for the positioning of the eyes, which originally indicate a look to the right. Here, in yellow lines, is a synthesis of the discoveries that can probably be attributed to Lisa Gherardini's portrait. But for the understanding of all audiences, as an anthropologist scientist will do when reconstructing a face from a skull, I have allowed myself this reconstruction from the LA.M images. The LA.M images also allow to find the clothing attributes of the Florentine bourgeoisie in 1503. Here, the finestrelles and nastri. Here, the acciaiolo, a Tuscan term, was a veil over the shoulder to soften the neckline. In this picture, these wonderful interlaces that originally went up the shoulder. Here is a synthesis of the elements discovered with the LA.M images and which can probably be attributed to the hidden portrait of Lisa Gherardini. This allows me to propose this complete simulation of the portrait of Lisa Gherardini, which can be compared to this portrait of a Florentine woman in 1507, or to this drawing by Raphael, who is said to have made a copy in the master's studio. In 2019, during a conference given at the Louvre Museum, and then published in the exhibition catalogue, the Louvre laboratory confirmed some of my findings of the Florentine dress and hairstyle. With another technical process, the X-ray mapping of copper's atom. This publication of the Louvre is important since it validates my findings published in 2015, and therefore the LA.M technique which I present to you today. With the mercury mapping, the Louvre laboratory will also confirm the discovery of the interlacing embroidery that LA.M images had already shown in 2015, that is go up to the shoulder. The final transformation. Why did the portrait of Lisa Gherardini become the Mona Lisa we see today? It is 1513. Leonardo is now living in the Vatican. He has a new patron, Giuliano di Medici, the Pope's brother. In 1513, Giuliano had a son who was only 3 years old. Hippolyte shown here in this painting. The child had no mother, who died in childbirth. In January 1514, Giuliano had to leave for France to marry a cousin of Francis I, Philibert de Savoie. The child remained alone in the Vatican. During his absence, Giuliano received letters from the Cardinal of Bibbiena. One sentence shows that the child is very keen on having a mother.
Hippolyte is well and says to all the men who ask him where the Lord your father has gone.
He is gone to fetch a woman, my mother.
He answered thus to the Pope. His Holiness laughed out loud.
The historian Roberto Zapperi suggests that, before leaving for France, Giuliano asked Leonardo for a portrait of a mother for his son. But in 1514, Leonardo had other concerns, notably studying the draining of the Pontine marshes, of which he makes a map here. He studied the problems of mirrors and worked on new binders and varnishes. Too busy with his other affairs, he probably does not have time to paint the portrait that Giuliano asked him for. Leonardo then resorts to a simpler and quicker solution. He takes the unfinished portrait of Lisa Gherardini, retains the landscapes, the hands, the chairs, the column, and corrects the position of the head, so that she is looking at the child. He put a long curling hair and changes the dress to make it more in keeping with the subject. In 1517, Leonardo was in France. He testified that he had painted this portrait at the request of Giuliano di Medici. Leonardo showed to the Cardinal 3 paintings, one of a certain Florentine woman done from life, at the instance of the late Magnificent Giuliano di Medici. But the transformation was not so simple. A new challenge for Leonardo. We saw earlier that the outline of the head in the portrait of Lisa Gherardini was higher. So, Leonardo had to erase it. But 10 years later, the oil paint was dry, hard, and difficult to erase. He then used a method of scratching by cross-hatching, clearly visible with the LA.M images. For the transformation of the face, Leonardo uses a glazing method made of thin layers of amber earth pigment rich in manganese. What appear to be a mask are clearly visible with the LA.M images. In 2008, my publication on the discovery of these glazes with the Professor Madi Elias of the CNRA was confirmed 2 years later by the Louvre laboratory. Here is a summary of what we can say today about the evolution and chronology of this portrait. Around 1501, probably a Madonna project that remained as a sketch. In 1503, the portrait of Lisa Gherardini, and in 1530, a profound transformation, probably carried out at the request of Giuliano di Medici, which makes the portrait of Lisa Gherardini disappeared. This is not an evolution, but a radical change of object and recipient. We might have suspected that the portrait of Lisa Gherardini is hidden underneath. The biographer Paolo Lomazzo has collected the testimony of Melzi, a pupil of Leonardo, who testifies very explicitly two portraits in one. The Gioconda portrait and Mona Lisa. Until now, it was thought that the hand was a typographical error and should have been an whore. But now we have a new element to evaluate the meaning of this hand. This landscape has been the subject of much ink, and without caricaturing, many regions of Italy see their valley, bridge, or mountains in it, if Leonardo has been there at least once. We will now examine it in detail. In this detail, we see 4 arches bridge crossing a river. The L.A.M image allows us to suggest the chronology, how step by step Leonardo painted this bridge. In this detail, an horizontal line is clearly visible, slightly inclined as on the horizon. Consequently, the blue waters may be those of a lake at the end of the valley. On the left, in the steep heights, is this disturbing and strange detail of a hanging rock, as we sometimes find in the mountains. However, the distance to the end of the valley gives it a gigantic proportions. Why was it important for Leonardo to include this detail in this work? On this detail are 1 or perhaps 2 lakes. This part of the landscape, characterized by a deserted and sinuous appearance, is the most interesting. Here, at first glance, one might think of a path. But if that were the case, the dimension will be disproportionate. In fact, it looks more like a riverbed. In the meanders, you can see the banks and the rounded, worn rocks. On this subject, Leonardo tells us,
"The sinuous course of the rivers, due to the rebound of their percussions against the banks, will deepen their beds above them, more than in any other part. When the river narrows, the soil of its bed is torn away and the soil no longer covers the stones or tuff. Where the river widens, small stones and sand will be deposited. Where it widens greatly, silt, mud, wood chips, and other light things will be deposited."
The last detail, which will be decisive for the rest of this study, is the presence of a strange pointed rock. The L.A.M images reveal the preparatory drawing of a tower, like many found in Italy. The drawing is in an intermediate layer of paint, invisible to traditional infrared. Leonardo's dream. The deviation of the Arno, the main bibliographical sources. Vasari, Leonardo's biographer, tells us, and he was the first, even so a young man, to discuss making the Arno River a canal from Pisa to Florence. In 1494, the French king Charles VIII restored the freedom to the Republic of Pisa. Thus, the Florentines who had occupied the city since 1406, also lost to precious access to the sea, important for trade. And this was the beginning of the war. Florence besieged Pisa, which resisted. And in 1496, there was talk of diverting the Arno for military purposes in order to deprive the peasants of the water and assistance they received by sea. In 1503, after 11 years of war, Pisa still resisted, and the idea of diverting the Arno resurfaced, supported in Florence by Machiavelli and Soderini, the Gonfaloniere. As far as Leonardo is concerned, we can say that this dream has a real obsessive character. He starts to write down his idea in his notebooks and already imagines where to divert the Arno. In 1503, as he begins to paint the portrait of Lisa Gherardini, he studies and draws maps of the diversion of the Arno and of its great canal. The river has too many meanders and is not navigable. Then the map became more precise, and still in 1503, he drew the towers and fortresses. It is perhaps this plan that was presented on the 24th July 1503 to a member of the Ten della Balla, a war committee of the city of Florence. Also in 1503, he made a colored map. He intended to convince the dignitaries of Florence to finance the project. The canal starts in Florence and joins the bed of the Arno, which is diverted at Cassina, crossing the lakes of Fuseco and Bientina. Pisa, located downstream, has no more water. The tower of Caprona stands on the edge of the dry-up river. But the Arno is capricious. Leonardo also studies the Val di Chiana, situated upstream from Florence, to use it as a reservoir to regulate the canal, so that it is navigable all year round. And also, on this very beautiful map, Leonardo takes care to draw the fortresses and towers. He is making this map for a vast hydraulic sanitation project and for his canal. He tells us,
sluices should be made in the valley of La Chiana at Arezzo, so that when, in the summer, the Arno lacks water, the canal may not remain dry.
Leonardo will study many technical solutions for the creation of this canal. Here, a system of dikes and breakwaters for the diversion of the Arno. It is worth noting the care and detail with which he drew up this study. Leonardo also studied the necessary machinery, here an excavator for digging the canal. Finally, the maps become even more precise. Leonardo places the diversion at Cassina, upstream from the tower of Caprona. He explicitly mentions on this map the tower of Caprona and the Verruca. The river bed will be drained at the foot of the tower. The existence of the fortress of Caprona dates back to well before the Renaissance and is already mentioned by Dante. In 1433, the Florentines would have dismantled the fortress, but the tower of Caprona was preserved, as evidenced by Leonardo's drawing of this tower in his landscape of the mountain of Pisa in 1503, which we will see next. All fortresses have a watchtower, which is fundamental both as a reliable geographical landmark visible from a great distance and in times of war for the surveillance of the territory. The Tower of Caprona was restored or rebuilt in the 19th century, demonstrating the importance of its location on top of a well-placed rock, a prime spot to watch the roads and ships on the Arno. Leonardo used this tower as a geographical landmark, as he testified on his note. He names Caprona twice. The tower, which is precisely within a loop of the Arno, could therefore be the one we found in the Mona Lisa landscape. Leonardo draws the Tower of Caprona in this view of the mountain of Pisa. We recognize the Arno, the fortress of La Verruca, and of course the Tower of Caprona, standing on its rock dominating the Arno. He mentioned Cassina and writes, "This is my point of view." The maps drawn by Leonardo show several hundred castles, fortresses, and towers on the summits. It is therefore quite likely that this architectural element can be found in the Mona Lisa landscape. On 24 July 1503, the Lordship of Florence sent Leonardo to inspect the fortress of Verruca. He made this drawing, in which we notice the same hanging rock observed on the steep rocks on the left of the Mona Lisa. But the remark is not new. Carlo Pedretti wrote,
"For Leonardo, it was no longer a word but an image, which could be magnified and multiplied in his landscape drawings and which could be projected into the backgrounds of Mona Lisa."
But digging the canal is expensive. He will calculate it. Despite Machiavelli's real support, it is difficult to convince the merchants and lords of Florence, who see, above all, what it will cost them. He writes,
"Which will benefit the country, and Prato, Pistoia and Pisa, as well as Florence, will gain 200,000 ducats a year. That the Corporation of Wool Merchants builds the canal and collects the revenues by passing it through Prato, Pistoia, Seraval, and will constitute a greater source of revenue."
It is thought that it is this map of Leonardo's canal project that is presented to the political authorities by Soderini and the Gonfaloniere and Machiavelli at the session of the Pratica on the 25th February 1504. They supported a simplified version of the canal, limited to the diversion of the Arno just before Pisa, to obtain the surrender of the peasants. These arguments were not enough to convince them, giving the bitter memories of Brunelleschi's attempt to divert the Cerchio River in 1430, which failed and flooded to the Florentine camp. Neither yes nor no. The minutes contain a warning that the project should go with nature, meaning that the diversion should be carried out at the place where the river naturally overflows. This is precisely what Leonardo had planned. At Cassina Fornacetta, or at Caprona, or near the Faggiana Tower. The organization of the diversion of the Arno was taken up in the inner circle of the Gonfaloniere of Justice. The work began on 20 August 1504. The direction of the work was entrusted to the master builder Colombino, who did not follow Leonardo's recommendation since he created two canals instead of one, it did not matter to Leonardo. He was elsewhere, and he knew that his project was progressing. The beginning of his dream was coming true. Convinced that once the first section has been completed and confidence established, the Lordship will build the entire canal. During this day, he probably continued to paint Lisa Gherardini, projecting into the landscape his imagination of a valley of the Arno transformed by the hand of man. Machiavel's letters read,
"The work has begun, 2,000 workers dig every day in the hot Tuscan soil. The work is hard, threatened by enemy incursions that the Florentine troops struggle to contain, and pay often runs out."
This manuscript of the time take up to the two diversions envisaged. Between Cassina and Pisa to go towards Stagno. On the 20 August 1504, work began on a double canal at the Fagina Tower, which was knocked down to use the materials. This may explain why Leonardo covered the drawing of the Caprona Tower in the Mona Lisa, which is situated upstream, where the Arno is still in its bed. But the idea of the dry-up river persists, and does Leonardo's dream. In the same manuscript, we learn that the cost of the work amounted over 7,000 ducats.
At the end of September 1504, when the soldiers were no longer able to protect the workers from the Pisan attacks, the Arno continued to grow. When it overflowed its bed, under the first shock of the water, it took with it the bank of the canal and resumed its former course. 7,000 ducats were spent at a pure loss. At the end of the summer, 2,000 workers got stuck in the river bed.
It is therefore likely that all the elements we have just seen can be found in this landscape painted in 1503. They are part of Leonardo's dream, a canal from Florence to the sea. First, the Val di Chiana at the bottom of the valley, then the surprising rock of the Verruca, the lakes crossed by his canal project, and of course, the dry Arno dominated by the Tower of Caprona, a geographical landmark to which he attached importance. On the right, a bridge synonymous with man's conquest over nature. All of these elements date from 1503. Not by chance. He painted Lisa Gherardini in 1503. It is coherent with the dates, with history, coherent with the archived documents, coherent with Leonardo's engineering spirit, coherent with his drawing, with observation, his preoccupation of the moment, coherent with the geography of the Arno Valley. It is coherent as a whole and with the reality of a tower that still stands today upright on its rock, a witness to this incredible project. Thank you for your attention.